want to welcome you all, and I'm very delighted, truly delighted to introduce Jennifer Rubenstein, who is Assistant Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. Her PhD is from the University of Chicago, my favorite university, and she's won much support for her work from the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Social Science Research Council, the Council for Advanced Studies in Peace and International Cooperation, the Aspen Institute, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she's been doing very interesting work on global justice, democratic theory, international ethics, and particularly theories of responsibility for those who hold different forms of office. She's published in the Journal of Politics and the Journal of Political Philosophy, my favorite journal, and in other places. She's currently working on a book manuscript entitled Just Samaritans, or Just Samaritans, the Politics and Ethics of Humanitarian Office, and it's from that work that her talk today comes. Anyone here who has ever worried about how NGOs sometimes claim to represent people and wonder exactly how they do and what the status of that claim is will really enjoy this talk. So thank you very much. Let's welcome.
Thanks. There's actually a handout.
A handout.
And the front of it is a outline of my talk, and on the back there's a little chart that I will refer to about 3/4 of the way through my talk. So thank you all very much for coming. I understand that I'm up against, I shouldn't even say this because you might leave, but I understand that I'm up against graduate feedback, so I appreciate you all being here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about NGO advocacy. Before I start, I just want to say a word about terminology. My comments today are going to focus on a small but influential group of non-governmental organizations that includes Oxfam and CARE and Doctors Without Borders. And there's at least two important things about these NGOs for my purposes. One is that they're based in wealthy Western countries, and the second is that they work all over the world. They work internationally. So they can therefore be distinguished from three other types of non-governmental organizations: domestic NGOs based in wealthy Western countries, domestic NGOs based in poor countries, and international NGOs based in poor countries. So despite the fact that I'm only talking about a small subset of actually existing NGOs, I'm going to refer to them just as NGOs. But I don't want you to think that I think that the set that I'm talking about is coextensive with the set that actually exists. In my paper, I refer to them as INGOs, which is a little bit better than NGOs. But for those of you who were born and raised in the United States, you might remember a little song about a farmer who had a dog. And, anyway, so you understand the aesthetic problem with talking to you about INGOs. Okay. This is auditory aesthetics. Okay. Beginning in the late 1970s, several large NGOs based in wealthy Western countries such as Oxfam and CARE broadened the scope of their activities beyond the direct provision of humanitarian and development aid to also include public advocacy campaigns. And I'm sure all of you have heard of many of these campaigns. Examples include the Jubilee 2000 campaign to cancel poor countries' debts, efforts to make trade fair by altering the rules of the World Trade Organization, and efforts to improve access to essential medicines for people in poor countries. So while statistics are scarce, there's little doubt that NGO advocacy is a prominent and growing feature of global politics. But responses to these campaigns from journalists, scholars, and activists in both wealthy and poor countries have been mixed. Some commentators have hailed NGOs' efforts to use advocacy to address the larger scale, more structural causes of severe poverty, that is, to move beyond being mere ladles in a global soup kitchen. But others have sharply criticized NGO advocacy campaigns. And these criticisms have frequently focused on NGOs' alleged lack of representativeness. As The Economist magazine asked in an off-cited article, who elected Oxfam? Few commentators argue that representativeness is the only normative standard against which NGO advocacy should be judged. Other criteria, such as efficacy and cost-effectiveness, are also widely seen as relevant. But the idea that NGO advocacy is representation as a descriptive matter and should be evaluated as such as a normative matter crops up frequently in debates about NGO advocacy. Now, the main attraction of holding NGOs to representation-based standards is that it appears to make NGO advocacy more democratic. NGOs acting as faithful representatives of poor and marginalized groups help those people to make their voices heard and have their preferences and interests taken into account by global decision makers. And so even though they're not formally elected, the thought here is that NGOs can, quote, give underrepresented people a voice at the global level. So for example, an NGO might represent the interests of African farmers to the trade ministers of wealthy governments, or represent Afghan women's preferences to the British public. Despite its seeming democratic credentials, I'm going to argue that we should not view international advocacy NGOs primarily as representatives. Rather, I'm going to argue that they should be conceptualized and normatively evaluated primarily in the language of justice. And this means that rather than view NGOs as representatives and evaluate them based on how representative they are, we should instead view them primarily as agents of justice and evaluate them based on whether they act justly themselves and promote justice on the part of other actors and institutions. So on this justice-based model, an NGO couldn't defend its advocacy campaign just by showing that it had accurately represented the interests of African farmers or the preferences of Afghan women. Rather, it would have to explain why its campaign promoted justice overall. And so this might entail showing, for example, that its efforts on behalf of African farmers hadn't harmed poor Chinese farmers, or that its protests on behalf of Afghan women addressed issues that were matters of justice and not merely taste or convenience. So I'm not going to suggest that we evaluate NGO advocacy only according to justice-based criteria, but what I want to say, and this is where I think political theory is most helpful, is that our first cut conceptualization of what NGO advocacy is and the normative orientation that derives from this conceptualization should be justice-based, not representation-based. So to some of you, this might sound stunningly obvious, but to others, it's likely to be deeply unappealing. And this is because while construing NGOs as representatives appears to make NGO advocacy more democratic, holding them to justice-based standards appears profoundly undemocratic. So in particular, when an NGO raises its metaphorical fist and yells, "Justice demands X," what is to ensure that the content of X will not be overly influenced by the NGO's own ideology, interests, or misguided good intentions, or those of its donors? So to overstate matters slightly, the language of justice appears to be a mere Trojan horse for neo-imperialist domination. Speed that talk after all. I will argue to the contrary that evaluating NGO advocacy according to justice-based standards is not only more just, but also more democratic than evaluating it according to representation-based standards. In particular, democratic norms of inclusiveness and self-determination are better promoted by construing NGOs as agents of justice than construing them as representatives. So I trace this counterintuitive result to two features of NGO advocacy. These are that NGOs operate in highly non-ideal circumstances and that they are second-best representatives of poor people. So the circumstances in which NGOs operate are non-ideal in the sense that they are characterized by severe scarcity, non-compliance with basic precepts of justice, and most importantly for my argument, a dearth of fully just institutions at both the local and global level. And NGOs are second-best representatives in the sense that they're often less accountable and well-funded than democratically elected governments, and less knowledgeable about local conditions than domestic NGOs based in poor countries. So this makes international NGOs second-best representatives of poor people in poor countries compared to either their own democratically elected governments or local NGOs, which are, at least potentially, first-best representatives. And I don't mean to suggest any sort of strict hierarchy. My only point is that actors other than international NGOs are likely to be, or at least have the potential to be, better representatives of poor people. Come in, than than international NGOs. So I'm going to say more about these two ideas later, but the upshot of my argument and the upshot of the broader project on which my comments today are based is that we need to take these two features of NGO advocacy extremely seriously. So consider, if you will, the norms that guide and inspire international NGOs. Norms of equality, dignity, fairness, democracy, autonomy, human rights, etc. These are extremely general ideas. They all can be interpreted and specified in myriad different ways. So if we look just at the context of NGO advocacy in particular, it seems at first as if the best way to specify and apply democratic norms is to construe NGOs as representatives. But because NGOs are second-best actors, and because they operate in highly non-ideal circumstances, this approach backfires. And what I'm going to suggest is that if we really care about making NGO advocacy more democratic, we should construe NGOs as agents of justice rather than as representatives of poor and marginalized people. So that's the idea. So my first task is to persuade you that NGOs are often construed as representatives, and indeed they are, by academics, journalists, and activists based in wealthy and poor countries. But it's important to note that over the past several years, many advocacy NGOs have themselves ceased to describe themselves in these terms. So it's true that the rock star Bono, who has his own NGO, claims to, quote, represent a lot of people in Africa who have no voice. And for this, he gets cited time and time again in political science journals. But in this respect, as in, I suppose, in several other respects, Bono is an anomaly. Indeed, in a recent survey, and here I'm quoting, less than 10% of the NGOs examined claimed to be speaking for the South or Southern NGOs. And likewise, my own recent analysis of the websites of several major anti-poverty NGOs yielded few references to the word represent or its cognates. So in arguing that NGOs should not be construed as representatives, I'm to some extent agreeing with NGOs themselves and defending them against their critics who accuse them of being bad representatives or unrepresentative. But as we'll see, the reasons why I think that NGOs should not be conceived of as representatives differ from the reason that NGOs themselves provide. So we'll come back to that. But let's return now to the academics and the journalists and the activists who do construe NGOs as representatives. And these commentators use the language of representation in several different ways to express a range of expectations and concerns. And I'm just going to tell you about three of those. First, NGOs' left-leaning critics argue explicitly that NGOs ought to be good representatives. You need more handouts?
There's some handouts. Just read one.
So these left-leaning critics argue explicitly that NGOs ought to be good representatives of poor and marginalized people. And they attribute this goal, in many cases, to NGOs themselves. So here are some sample quotations. NGOs frequently attempt to represent the interests of citizens whose voices are not heard in the international arena. NGOs frequently claim to be the spokespeople of global civil society, acting as much-needed representatives for disenfranchised groups such as the poor, the sick, and the oppressed. NGOs must stop being preoccupied with their own narrowly interpreted bureaucratic mandate and get down to the business of seeking out and listening to the poor in order to secure a mandate to speak clearly and with conviction on their behalf. So it's easy to see why these critics want NGOs to act as representatives. Procedurally, poor and marginalized people are underrepresented in global institutions, so by representing them, NGOs can help to level the playing field. Substantively, poor and marginalized people are seriously harmed by the actions of far-flung governments and corporations and other actors, and so by representing the poor, NGOs can help to reduce these harms. And so on this account, NGO advocacy goes wrong when NGOs misrepresent the preferences or the interests of specific groups of poor people on issues such as trade-offs between environmental protection and economic growth, trade liberalization, and the promotion of the Millennium Development Goals. So a second way that the language of representation is invoked in discussions of NGO advocacy can be found in the work of academic democratic theorists that Jenny is familiar with by now. So these is particularly theorists of non-electoral representation. For example, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on political representation states that, quote, given the role that international non-governmental organizations play in the international arena, the representatives of dispossessed groups are no longer located in the formal political arena of the nation-state. As this quotation suggests, democratic theorists sometimes just assume that NGO advocacy is a form of non-electoral representation. And so the pressing question for them is not whether NGOs do or should represent, but given that they represent, how should their representation be made legitimate? And so by assuming that NGO advocates are representatives and focusing on this question of how their representation can be made legitimate, democratic theorists miss the entire prior question of whether NGO advocacy should even be seen as representation in the first place. A third way in which the language of representation arises in discussions of NGO advocacy can be found in arguments made by NGOs' right-leaning critics. These arguments, which are often highly rhetorical, tend to proceed by comparing NGOs unfavorably to elected representatives, as in the quotation from The Economist on your handout. So for example, and there's lots and lots of examples of this. Quote, so here's an example. Claims of NGOs to represent civil society as a whole, and as such, to possess legitimacy rivaling, even exceeding, that of elected governments is outrageous. So, in short, the international advocacy NGOs are often viewed as representatives. So now I want to describe two arguments against viewing NGOs in this way. But before doing that, I want to briefly note a third argument against holding NGOs to representation-based standards. Now, this argument is sometimes made by NGOs themselves, but I think it's a red herring. And this argument states that NGOs shouldn't be evaluated based on how well they represent, because NGOs don't act as representatives in the first place. So they shouldn't be normatively evaluated on this basis because they don't do it. So I agree that NGOs shouldn't be normatively evaluated primarily based on how well they represent, but this is not because they do not act as representatives. NGOs do, in fact, represent poor and marginalized people in the sense of making substantive claims about their wishes or interests to third parties. And indeed, I'll argue later that it's sometimes appropriate for them to do so. So the reason why NGOs shouldn't be construed primarily as representatives isn't because they never represent. To the contrary, NGOs should not be evaluated based on how well they represent, despite the fact that they engage in representation some of the time. So here's an analogy to explain this idea. Imagine a high school science teacher who shows movies in class. Maybe you all had high school science teachers who did this. It would be, maybe showing movies in class is only valuable insofar as it's an effective means to educating students, and sometimes it is an effective means to educating students. But it would be counterproductive to evaluate the teacher based on his movie-showing excellence, especially if doing so encouraged him to show more movies than was educationally ideal. Analogously, while NGOs do and perhaps even should act as representatives some of the time, as a means to the end of promoting justice, it would be counterproductive to evaluate them on that basis, or at least that's what I'm going to argue. So, NGOs are right that they should not be viewed primarily as representatives, but they're wrong that the reason for this is that they don't engage in representation. So I'm going to tell you now what I think are two better reasons to not construe NGOs as representatives. And as we'll see later, unlike NGOs' flat denial that they engage in representation at all, the two reasons that I'm going to outline accommodate what I think is the fact that NGOs do and should act as representatives some of the time. Okay, problem number one. A first problem with evaluating NGO advocacy according to how representative NGOs are is that norms of representativeness say nothing about how NGOs should choose whom to advocate for in the first place. A good representative is at least somewhat partial to her constituents, regardless of whether she is representing their interests or preference or some other thing about them. Thus, construing NGOs as representatives focuses attention on their responsibilities to the people for whom they're already advocating, and downplays initial or ongoing decisions about whom they should advocate for. Construing NGOs as representatives can therefore work against those groups and causes that NGOs tend to overlook. So this includes groups that are unorganized, hard to reach, or who would, for some other reason, benefit from a more formal or explicit commitment on the part of NGOs to equal consideration of their claims. So imagine an NGO trying to decide whether to advocate on issues related to HIV or malaria, small arms or landmines, debt relief or trade rules. Now, there might or might not be good, practical or principled reasons for choosing one of these over the other, but norms of representativeness provide no critical foothold for making these decisions. All they do is encourage limited partiality on the part of the NGO toward the individual or group for whom it is already advocating. So regardless of whether one thinks that NGOs have a duty to allocate their advocacy efforts in a particular way, such allocative decisions have moral content. This would be the case even if NGO advocacy campaigns made some poor people better off and none worse off. But as Roger Riddell writes, and I'm quoting, in most cases, some poor people will tend to benefit, either relatively or absolutely, from the consequences of changes in the external policy regime, and some will be adversely affected. So, for example, poor people in urban areas usually benefit when the prices of basic commodities fall, while poor farmers tend to benefit when prices of basic commodities rise. So this means that NGOs' decisions about how to allocate advocacy are not only decisions about how to allocate benefits, they are at least sometimes decisions about how to allocate negative effects. So here it's helpful to compare NGOs to formal elected representatives, say in the US House of Representatives. These representatives don't have to make large-scale decisions about how to allocate their representational labors. These decisions are made for them, at least in part, by the institution in which they are embedded. So Tom Perriello represents Virginia's 5th District, right? And so he has to make some decisions, but at least he knows that Virginia's 5th District is his district, right? Because NGOs are not embedded in that kind of institution, they can't avoid making large-scale allocative decisions. Yet the language of representation provides no guidance to them for doing so. So that's problem number one. Here's problem number two, which I call the displacement problem. So I've been arguing that because representation standards say nothing helpful about how NGO advocacy should be allocated, construing NGOs as representatives can be detrimental to poor people who are dispersed, unappealing, or forgettable to NGOs and their donors. But construing NGOs as representatives can also be bad for the people NGOs do advocate for. And the reasons for this return us to the idea of NGOs as second-best representatives that I mentioned at the outset. So as you'll recall, I said that northern NGOs are second-best representatives compared to well-functioning, adequately funded democratic domestic governments. And this is because, compared to democratic domestic governments, northern NGOs are often small, financially insecure, and only weakly accountable to those directly affected by their actions. Northern NGOs are also second-best representatives compared to competent, well-funded southern NGOs, because compared to southern NGOs, northern NGOs are often ill-informed about local conditions and tone-deaf to a region's social and political dynamics. So in short, on various measures, several other types of actors are at least potentially better representatives of poor and marginalized people than northern NGOs. But unfortunately, despite the potential for southern NGOs and domestic governments to function as first-best representatives for poor and marginalized people, they often fail to do so. When this happens, however, northern NGOs can exacerbate these problems by displacing southern NGOs in particular. So northern NGOs can use their experience, their knowledge, their connections, and their material resources to represent a particular group of poor people. And that seems really great, but in so doing, they absorb the funding and the talented employees and the political opportunities and the media coverage and the strategic alliances that would or might otherwise go to a southern NGO. And that's what I mean by displacement. So, of course, northern NGOs don't inevitably displace southern NGOs, but crowding out and disempowerment of southern NGOs by northern NGOs can and does occur. And the language of representation, I think, exacerbates this tendency. And this isn't only because of the power differentials between northern and southern NGOs, but also because of the structure of representation itself. So as Hannah Pitkin argues, people who are represented must, quote, be present in some sense while not being present literally or fully in fact. So representation-based normative standards thus create an incentive for NGOs to displace by making speaking for the morally privileged position, right? So the idea is if you can only be legitimate when you're speaking for somebody else, you have an incentive to do that, and that can lead to this displacement problem that I'm talking about. When representativeness is the royal road to legitimacy, NGOs always have a reason to speak for someone, so they always have a reason to displace, right? So it should by now be clear why, the second reason why representation-based normative standards are problematic when applied to northern NGOs. While such standards encourage NGOs to be good representatives, in many cases that's not what we want. In many cases, northern NGOs should step back and get out of the way, or maybe even encourage representation by first-best representatives. And that such activities of stepping back or capacity building are not only not representation, they can even stand in some tension with representation. Okay, so that's problem number two. So I now want to suggest that viewing NGOs as agents of justice can go some way towards avoiding the allocation problem and the displacement problem. So the first thing to say here is that evaluating NGOs according to your or my favorite list of immutable principles of justice is unlikely to be either democratically indispensable or practically effective. Or maybe your principles would be okay, but not my principles. So an alternative approach is to focus on the language of justice as compared to the language of representation. And here you can take a look at the flip side of your handout. Construing NGOs as agents of justice can shape the normative conversation about their advocacy efforts in significant and useful ways, even if there is no final agreement about precise evaluative criteria. My suggestion, therefore, is that NGOs, their critics, intended beneficiaries, donors, and others should argue about NGO advocacy campaigns in the language of justice rather than the language of representation. So how do these two languages differ? To begin with, they have different vocabularies and organizing images. They foreground and elide different issues. For example, the language of representation asks whether an NGO effectively promotes a particular constituency's wishes and or interests. In contrast, many conceptions of justice are based on interpretations of ideas such as impartiality, fairness, and equal consideration. So the language of justice might ask whether an actor is acting consistently with a persuasive interpretation of these ideas. In addition to foregrounding different issues, the language of representation and the language of justice also involve different processes of justification. While a representative must explain herself primarily to her constituents in terms of their preferences and or interests, the agent of justice has a prima facie duty to explain itself to everyone significantly affected by its actions in terms of concepts such as fairness, impartiality, and equal treatment. So of course, the cost of doing this might be prohibitive in any given case, but my suggestion is just the initial normative orientation ought to be toward everyone significantly affected and not only towards those being represented. Both the language of justice and the language of representation require NGOs to deliberate extensively with poor and marginalized people. However, the purpose of this deliberation differs in the two cases. A good representative must deliberate with her constituents in order to discern their wishes and or interests. The agents of justice, in contrast, should deliberate with everyone or representatives of everyone significantly affected by its proposed campaigns. While these deliberations will likely touch on the preferences and interests of those affected, discerning preferences and interests is not the ultimate purpose of the deliberations. Rather, the ultimate purpose is to figure out whether the campaign in question is likely to promote or did promote justice overall. And again, because NGO's capacity and expertise are limited, it sometimes makes perfect sense for a given NGO to focus its energies on a particular group or issue. But the justice-based model that I'm describing suggests that this decision itself to focus on a particular issue ought to itself be defended in the language of justice and not the language of representation. Because representation works better when those being represented are similar with respect to whatever it is about them that's being represented, NGOs conceived of as representatives have an incentive to downplay disagreements or differences among those for whom they are advocating. In contrast, conceiving of NGOs as agents of justice foregrounds the need for them to make difficult judgments that incorporate conflicting justice-based claims of different groups. This acknowledgement is descriptive, not normative. It faces the fact that however much they consult and deliberate with different groups, NGOs are ultimately responsible for making their own allocative decisions and setting their own priorities. The language of representation doesn't change this fact, it merely obscures it. The NGO acting as an agent of justice thus has grounds to argue with Southern NGOs and representatives of groups of poor people to say that, look, while this particular course of action might be consistent with your wishes or interests, it's unfair to or harms the basic interests of some other group. And the corresponding implication for community-based organizations and Southern NGOs is that in their negotiations with Northern NGOs, they have reason to explain what they want in terms of how it will promote or be consistent with justice overall. So that's what I mean by the idea that we might be able to construe and normatively evaluate NGOs as agents of justice. And now I want to explain how this approach helps to avoid the allocation problem and the displacement problem that I talked about a few minutes ago. So you remember that the allocation problem is the idea that while NGOs must make decisions about how to allocate their advocacy efforts, the language of representation offers no traction for doing so. The language of justice does offer some traction on this question, however, even there's disagreement about what justice requires. Insofar as the language of justice involves some conception of equal consideration, debates about what would constitute a just allocation of NGO advocacy direct attention to the question of who is being left out or passed over, and what sorts of explanations are owed to those people. By encouraging NGOs to take a broad and impartial view when deciding among potential advocacy campaigns, the language of justice thus makes present those who are passed over by these campaigns. In so doing, it embodies the democratic norm of inclusion. Now, I hasten to add that this conclusion is admittedly, at least at the outset, very thin and abstract. But remember that representation-based standards ignore the fact that NGOs are even making allocative decisions about advocacy in the first place. So, very thin inclusion of everyone is, I would submit, more inclusive than overlooking the issue of allocation entirely. And next I turn to how the language of justice avoids the displacement problem. Construing NGOs as agents of justice also helps to avoid the displacement problem. Remember that this problem arises because northern NGOs are second-best representatives, so evaluating them based on how representative they are can encourage them to displace nascent first-best representatives, such as southern NGOs. Now, holding northern NGOs to justice-based standards doesn't necessarily prevent them from displacing southern NGOs. You can easily imagine a northern NGO describing its activities in the language of justice, displacing southern NGOs making similar claims or representation-based claims. But while northern NGOs construed as agents of justice sometimes displace southern NGOs, construing northern NGOs as representatives makes that displacement more likely, at least at a conceptual level, because that which is represented, as I argued before, cannot be fully present. Likewise, while representation-based standards create an incentive for northern NGOs to displace by making representativeness the source of their legitimacy, justice-based standards do not. Because, or insofar as democratic governments and southern NGOs are first-best representatives, holding them to normative standards of representativeness helps to support the democratic norm of self-determination. We want first-best representatives to be excellent representatives. But because northern NGOs are second-best representatives, holding them to standards of representativeness doesn't have the same effect. Rather, it encourages them to displace first-best representatives. In contrast, evaluating NGO advocacy campaigns on the basis of whether they promote justice overall leaves room for NGOs to step back and make way for competent first-best representatives when doing so is appropriate, to actively support nascent first-best representatives when that makes more sense, or in those rare or dire situations when there are no potential or nascent first-best representatives to support, to act as representatives themselves. So even if we conceive of justice as a language rather than a set of precepts, and even if we acknowledge that promoting justice requires NGOs to deliberate extensively with poor people, we should still worry about the problem of imperiousness. That is, we should still worry that NGOs will intentionally or inadvertently disregard other actors' ideas about what justice requires. So it's all well and good to say, oh, Oxfam should use the language of justice and defend its actions to the Malawian government or a local Malawian NGO, but because Oxfam isn't accountable to those actors, there's no guarantee that it will take their input seriously. So this lack of accountability is a problem for justice-based normative standards. If NGOs are agents of justice, then who is to hold them accountable? In contrast, the language of representatives seems to make the problem of accountability more tractable. If an NGO represents Group X, then it should be accountable to the members of Group X. But when it comes to informal, self-selected advocates such as NGOs, the representation-based model doesn't do any better than the justice-based model on issues of accountability. In both cases, accountability is likely to be informal, public, and discursive, rather than formal and procedural. NGOs must explain themselves publicly to various audiences, including their donors, and receive approbation or disapproval on that basis. So in short, the difference between the two models isn't that one involves accountability and the other doesn't. Rather, the difference is the standard to which NGOs are held, representativeness in one case, justice promotingness in the other. Okay. So, construing NGOs as agents of justice has real drawbacks, but because it avoids the allocation problem and the displacement problem, it's generally preferable to construing NGOs as representatives. That's what I've said so far. I also noted that contrary to what they themselves sometimes claim, NGO advocates do sometimes engage in representation, and I have several examples of how they do this in my paper. So now we have to ask, under what conditions, if any, should NGOs represent poor marginalized groups, and how should such practices of representation be evaluated? And I think that the arguments that I presented so far can help us to answer these questions. And in particular, what I would say is it's more acceptable for NGOs to act as representatives and to be evaluated as such in cases where the allocation problem and the displacement problem are unlikely to arise, or at least unlikely to be particularly severe. So it's more acceptable to construe an NGO as a representative in situations when the NGO doesn't have to make difficult decisions about how to allocate its advocacy efforts. So if an NGO is pre-committed to a particular issue or geographic area, or if it's undertaking a broad, and hypothetically, if it's undertaking a broad-based campaign that helps millions of people but hurts no one, in those cases, there aren't any allocative decisions to be made, and so construing NGOs as representatives doesn't obscure those decisions. And the same logic applies to the displacement problem. Representation-based standards are more appropriate in situations where displacement is less likely to occur, either because there are no nascent first best representatives for NGOs to displace, or because NGOs have reformed themselves in such a way that they are themselves first best representatives, or because first best representatives are so secure and competent that there's no danger of a northern NGO displacing them. So in short, it's more appropriate to hold NGOs to representation-based rather than justice-based standards when the allocation and displacement problems are less likely to arise. But even in these cases, being excellent representatives is not the goal, I think. Promoting justice is the goal. Representation is a means to the end of promoting justice, just as, returning to our science teacher analogy, showing movies is a means to the end of educating students. But even if representation is a limited means to an important end, minimum normative standards would still seem to apply. In particular, NGOs should not egregiously misrepresent. And so misrepresentation is different from and worse than the absence of representation, because to be misrepresented is to be used for an end that one does not will. Not misrepresenting people's wishes and or interests, that seems to me to be a side constraint on NGO advocacy. So as you'll recall from what I said earlier, NGOs argue that they shouldn't be evaluated as representatives because they don't represent. And I've offered now a more complex, but I think more plausible argument, which is NGOs shouldn't be viewed or evaluated primarily as representatives insofar as doing so exacerbates the allocation problem and the displacement problem. But when those problems aren't salient, NGOs can and perhaps should act as representatives as a means to the end of promoting justice, so long as they don't misrepresent. In conclusion, I've suggested that NGO advocacy campaigns should be evaluated primarily based on how well they instantiate and promote some conception of justice. Now, this approach initially seems less democratic than holding NGOs to representation-based standards. But I've argued that holding NGOs to justice-based standards is more likely to promote democratic norms of inclusion and self-determination than holding them to representation-based standards. So what's the appropriate response to this conclusion? I think that it's an attitude or ethos of regret. And this brings us back to the two themes that I mentioned at the beginning of NGOs as second-best actors operating in highly non-ideal circumstances. So the language of justice is preferable to the language of representation because of these two features of NGOs in the context in which they operate, and these two features are ultimately regrettable. So it's regrettable that NGOs are not embedded in a fair democratic institution charged with allocating their advocacy efforts, such as this task is left to individual NGOs to do themselves. But insofar as that is how things are, a justice-based approach that highlights the question of how NGO advocacy is allocated is more likely to promote democratic norms of inclusion than a representation-based approach. Likewise, because northern NGOs are second-best representatives compared to democratically elected governments and southern NGOs, evaluating northern NGOs according to justice-based standards is more conducive to self-determination than evaluating them according to representation-based standards because, or insofar as, it avoids the displacement problem. In short, acknowledging the full implications of NGO status as second-best actors, acting in highly non-ideal circumstances, leads to the conclusion that construing NGOs as agents of justice is preferable to construing them as representatives, especially on democratic grounds.